Hey everybody, Professor Snart just checking in here. So we're finished up with Unit 9, which was the modern world challenging the past. And so we have this funny thing that happens where we're getting closer to our contemporary time period. So you'd think that the readings would get a little more accessible because they're dealing with a world that's more familiar to us in language and genres that are maybe more contemporary and not hundreds or 1,000 years old from a culture that is completely different from ours. But what you maybe found is that in looking at these modernist works, we actually have the sense of being maybe more distant, if not, ironically, more distant in terms of accessibility. Sometimes it's easier, for whatever reason, to read Homer's Odyssey, and that seems closer to us than Eliot's The Wasteland. Even though there's interesting parallels between those two works as kinds of epics or sort of dealing with the world at large. But anyway, sort of an irony that the closer we're getting to contemporary works, the less accessible they sometimes become. And in many ways, and again, the title for this unit is Challenging the Past, we actually get that sense of inaccessibility as an intentional quality of some of the works that we're reading. So particularly somebody like Eliot, T.S. Eliot, in fact, argued that work needs to be allusive. It needs to refer to works outside of itself, which requires a lot on the part of the reader, or like footnotes, where there's more footnotes than text on some of the pages of The Wasteland. And he also argued that things needed to be elusive, in other words, difficult to grasp for the reader, which sounds totally unfair from our perspective as readers, but he was very conscious about making this choice and requiring of the reader a real substantial engagement with his work. It was not just that he wanted to, frustrate people, but it was really part of a conscious and thought-out effort on his and many other people's part to re-engage people with works of art in a way that hadn't been happening previously, he thought, and many others thought, in terms of this modernist movement. Ezra Pound developed this saying or this dictum for the modernist movement. He simply said that the idea in all facets of the arts was to make it new. So there was this real insistence on presenting sometimes familiar material, but in an unfamiliar way, or presenting familiar material, but in such a fragmentary way that it was sort of defamiliarized for us. So we were forced to deal with the world that we thought we knew, but presented in this very different or defamiliarizing or new way. And again, it's not just poor writing or sloppy craftsmanship on the part of someone like Eliot, or an attempt to just frustrate readers. It really is part of an overall kind of artistic agenda for reinvigorating the arts out of the malaise that they saw as part of the late Victorian period in English literature, but really Western literature more broadly, which doesn't make it any easier for us. But again, part of what I'm aware of in this unit is the irony of it being closer to us in terms of history, but the readings themselves being much more difficult to glean anything from, honestly. So you have to, in some ways, just trust that they're important documents for their time period. And in some cases were really revolutionary, like The Wasteland and like some of Joyce's work, Ulysses and some of his other novels. Finnegan's Wake is an impossibly difficult text to read, but exists as an important text in its time period. So in some ways it helps to think of what we're reading not as a set of ideas that you have to believe or disbelieve, or that you personally have to see the greatness of The Wasteland the first time you try to wade through it, which is near impossible, I think. But in some ways you just have to trust the historical record that The Wasteland was and remains important as an historical document, if you want to think of it that way, instead of as a quote-unquote great poem. And it does repay rereading if you have the energy and the time, of course, to make that effort. But we had quite a sort of mix of readings for this unit anyway. But we move on to a unit that focuses just on Virginia Woolf and the selection we have from her very famous essay, fiction, whatever you want to call it, A Room of One's Own, manifesto or document. It tends to be a multi-genre piece, which I think is something that our textbook mentions. And it's really funny to move from, say, The Wasteland, for example, or some of the other readings from Unit 9 into Virginia Woolf, because they're more or less contemporary. So they're writing from the same social and historical place. But the quality of the writing, I don't mean good or bad, I just mean the style of it, is so, on the surface, radically different. It would be hard to say that both The Wasteland is this new or attempt to make it new, this very disjointed kind of language and imagery. But Woolf, who writes in a very different style, is equally modern in the sense that she's trying something, again, very consciously different in terms of presenting ideas. And I don't want to get too much into the male versus female kind of writing. I think that's too simplistic an argument. But you'll find that as you're reading A Room of One's Own, it's almost like, sometimes I feel like I'd like to make corrections to it, like I'm reading an early draft of what would become maybe something more polished. But it's important to realize that Woolf was a craftsman, a craftsperson, in the same way that Eliot was, or any of the other readers or writers that we've looked at. So the offhand quality of A Room of One's Own, it sort of begins an idea and then goes to something else, and you're back to the same idea, which repeats again a couple of pages later. Sentences kind of end midstream, and then something else pops up. That style is very, I think, conscious on her part, as far as creating, again, this sort of new way of presenting an argument or an idea. So it really is an essay that she's writing, but it's not in a form that you'd ever want to hand in as a college paper, for example. It repeats a lot, there's lots of tangents, it gets very personal and informal in places. So it, and again, quite consciously breaks all of these conventional rules that we normally expect to see. So her writing is as experimental as some of the other stuff that we read for Unit 9, even though on the surface it may not seem avant-garde in any kind of sense. But anyway, it's interesting just to make a stylistic comparison between Woolf and then some of the other stuff that we've read. So I'll let you look at some of the video material I've compiled here. Hopefully the discussion questions prompt some interesting discussion response essays for Unit 10. And as always, if you have questions or concerns about anything that's going on, just let me know.